Welcome to this Kansas Candidates Debate on Smoky Hills Public Television, featuring the two major party nominees for the 40th District of the Kansas Senate. I'm your moderator, Chapman Rackaway, Professor of Political Science and Senior Policy Fellow of the Docking Institute of Public Affairs at Fort Hays State University. And I'm joined tonight, first of all, by editor and publisher of the Hays Daily News, Patrick Lowry.
Greetings, Chap.
And the two candidates, Republican Rick Billinger of Goodland.
Good afternoon.
And Democrat Alex Herman of Hays.
Hi, Chap.
Thank you all for being here today. Our format is going to be conducted in the following fashion. Each candidate will give a 90-second opening statement. We'll then begin asking questions alternating between Mr. Lowry and myself. Each candidate will get 90 seconds to answer the question, followed by a 90-second rebuttal from the other candidate. We'll alternate the order of asking questions, and to be fair and to prevent filibustering, I'll keep strict time and cut off anyone who exceeds their allotted 90 seconds. At the end of the debate, each candidate will have one more 90-second closing statement available to them. Questions were written either by me, by Pat Lowry, or submitted to me via social media such as Facebook and Twitter. Before the debate began, Mr. Billinger deferred to Alex Herman, who chose to go last. Therefore, he will also get first word, meaning Alex Herman, 90 seconds to you, sir.
Thanks, Chap. Good evening. I'd like to thank KOD and Representative Billinger for the opportunity to discuss these issues most important to Kansas. I'm a fifth-generation Ellis County resident who resides in Hays with my wife, Abby, and our two children, Braden and Samantha. I'm a graduate of Thomas More Prep Marion High and the University of Kansas. I currently practice law in Hays with my family's law firm, where I specialize in criminal and juvenile defense work. I'm here today because our great state can't afford Sam Brownback and his legislative allies anymore. Governor Brownback came to power promising to lift the state out of the Great Recession. He promised to bring the state tens of thousands of new jobs, prosperity, and lower taxes. Instead, we're suffering in a persistent recession. We are hemorrhaging jobs. The state budget is in shambles, and our credit has been downgraded on multiple occasions. We've stolen billions from KDOT, and our schools and hospitals are suffering. Representative Billinger has been a Brownback ally from day one, amassing a 97.7% voting record with Governor Brownback in the last term of the legislature. He voted to reward his wealthy contributors with a tax plan that eliminated the income tax liability on their business income, while he raised your sales tax, eliminated your child care tax credit, and cut money from services for disabled children and the elderly. Kansas is a wreck, and we cannot afford to trust the person who helped destroy it to lead the way out of it. It's time to move beyond Brownback and put Kansas back on track.
That's time for you. 90 seconds, Representative Billinger.
Thank you. First, I'd like to correct the statement that was made by Alex. Number one, I did not vote for the tax cuts in 2012. So I want to make sure we get that straight right off. But Rick Billinger, I live in Goodland, Kansas. I'm a retired businessman. I was in business in Goodland for over 35 years. Also, I own a family farm up there. I'm an Army veteran, and I've a graduate of Fort Hays State University. I've served 2 terms in the Kansas House. I served in 2011 and 2012. I lost the district for 120th district in 13 and 14. That district went back to Kansas City. When the judges redrew the district, they drew that district back to Kansas City. So I was out for 2 years, and then when Board Cassidy decided he was going to retire, he contacted me and said, you know, Rick, you need to get back in there. So I ran, and I've served the last 2 years. One of the big items that we've had for the last 2 years is the tax cuts, the LLC loopholes and the tax cuts. I was one of 27 last year that voted to reinstate the taxes. We took on the governor, we took on special interest. This year I was one of 47. Last year out of 27, not one Democrat, not one. This year, there were a few.
And that's time for you. We'll have plenty of time for both of you to explore all of those things that you're mentioning. But Pat, why don't you take us away with our first question?
Well, I have a feeling we'll be talking all kinds of finances and budgeting, and I'll start with you, Rick. The budget for this year was passed with approximately $343 million deficit heading into this year, and that is going to grow. We're already $67 million short in our revenue projections. The delayed payments to the schools that were delayed from July or from June into July will hit the books. I don't expect the revenue forecast to get any better. We have an obvious problem for the current fiscal year. How will you address the problem? What will the solution be for this year?
Thank you for that question. There are no simple solutions.
Correct.
It is going to be a very difficult session. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the first things we have to fix is our revenue. With the tax cuts of 2012, we continually come in under budget. I voted against the budget last year, primarily because it wasn't a balanced budget. The governor was going to have to make cuts. The deferred payments to CAPERS, one of the committees I'm on is pensions and benefits. We've worked very hard for the last 6 years trying to get that back to solvency. I think we've done a really good job. We're at almost 68% funded now. When I went down there in 2011, it was the second worst state-funded pension fund in the United States. It was on the verge of bankruptcy. The first year we put an additional $280 million in. Last year we put $1 billion through a bond issue. And basically, once the money is over into CAPERS, it cannot be touched. They put out earlier that the governor was taking money from CAPERS. No, you can never get into CAPERS funds. Not the legislator, not the governor, no one. When it's put into that bank, it's a lockbox. And basically, we took some unfunded liability and funded it with bonds.
All right. Thank you very much. 90 seconds for Alex Herman to respond.
Pat, it's no dispute that the governor's tax plan has been an absolute disaster. I think the first and foremost thing we need to focus on is determining whether or not we have enough votes to be able to repeal the governor's tax plan, as it has failed the state of Kansas and our government. Assuming we don't have enough votes, we need to look at what we can work with the governor on to talk some sense into him and what measures of it can be repealed. The burdening of individuals with increases in sales tax, like Representative Billinger voted for last year, I think hurts working Kansans too much. I think that it's an unfair way to address our tax issues in this state, and I think that we need to look at forcing the donors of Governor Brownback, who were the biggest benefactors of the governor's tax plan, into paying their fair share.
Okay.
All right. Let's stay with that, at least conceptually, for the next question, because it's all well and good. You've discussed some of the generalities of our finances, but let's talk specifics now. And specifically because Mr. Billinger mentioned the LLC tax exemption. And there have been a number of folks who have said that the LLC tax exemption, getting rid of it, as was proposed in the 2016 session, would be enough to forestall the revenue drops the state has been dealing with. So a two-part question to you: should the LLC exemption remain in place? And would that be alone enough, do you think, to adequately fund state services? You've got 90 seconds.
I think repealing the LLC exemption is a step in the right direction. However, I do not feel that it is enough. When we look at all the other cuts that we've had in terms of revenue sources for Kansas under Governor Brownback, the fact that our state is hemorrhaging jobs, hemorrhaging people as well, we can't expect things to go back in 2017 to where they were when Governor Brownback took office. As such, I don't think the numbers work the same anymore, and I think that we need to look at other options that are available to us. In addition, we also need to look at correcting previous issues that were wrong with the tax code. Kansas right now has the highest sales tax on food in the country. We're one of only 18 states that has any sort of sales tax on food whatsoever. As a result of that, you have lots of people that live close to the borders with states like Colorado, Missouri, Nebraska, people in Representative Billinger's and own district who drive out of state to go grocery shopping. Making other adjustments along with the LLC, although it's a step in the right direction, I don't believe will be enough.
All right, 90 seconds to you.
You know, as far as the LLC, I think we need to do that. When you go into legislative services and you say, how much revenue will this generate? They can't even tell you. You know, originally, there was projected to be 186,000 take advantage of this. Last year, it was 334,000. Projected to be almost 400,000 next year. And if these folks aren't filing, the state doesn't know what kind of revenue they're losing out on. And as far as the sales tax, you know, if we had not raised sales tax last year, Fort Hays State would have lost $38 million. Probably would have closed Fort Hays State till we'd have got something done. We passed that at the end of the session. And if we hadn't passed something by Monday morning, the state was out of money. Out of money. And without that additional revenue, where would we be today? You know, you mentioned earlier, we're short, you know, 20 million. We're short 60 million. I mean, it's continually, we continue to miss our estimates. You know, that's one of the things that the Senate, the Republicans in the Senate have agreed to come up with our own budget. We're going to try to produce our own budget and say, here, Governor, here's what we think we need. Now, we'll have to negotiate, but we're going to produce our own budget instead of waiting for a budget to come down that we can't support or vote for. And in 2012,
Convenient time for to cut that one off. And Pat, you've got the next question.
And this one's going to Rick first?
Yes, it is.
Okay. We'll keep following on the same theme because I want to come back to my first question that I don't think either of you got to answering. But that's okay. That's why we're going to spend the whole hour with this. Let's just assume, for argument's sake, we repeal the LLC exemptions. And let's also assume that we remove the sales tax from food, for starters, at least the LLCs. What are we going to do for this current fiscal year to raise enough money to fund the services that exist today?
my question?
Yes.
All yours.
Okay. You know, first off, when I got there in 2012, actually 2011, when I got there in 2011, the state had a $500 million deficit. That's what was left. The first year Brownback came in, there was $86, $87 in the checkbook, and a $500 million deficit. When I left in 2012, we had a surplus of over $500 million and hadn't raised taxes at all, done it with efficiencies. So at that time, I voted to take sales tax off of food. And unfortunately, we went the other direction, and the LLC cut took priority over cutting food sales tax.
So let's put it back in, but we're still not going to have enough money to fund this year's budget.
We don't know. You know, how much is enough? The projection was when the 186,000
until next tax.
Right, it'll be a whole year.
Right.
That's, I mean,
Well,
there
we've still
are
got
no
this year
quick,
going
easy.
on.
There are no quick, easy fixes.
Right.
There just isn't, and there's no way that we could cut food sales tax at this point. I mean, there's no money there to do it. You know, people expect good schools, good roads, good hospitals. You know, we all have to pay a little to make sure that it's all covered. People are tired of high property tax. Property tax are getting to be a real burden, especially for our elderly.
Okay.
We'll let you come back to that later, but 90 seconds in a response for Alex Herman.
You know, ever since Governor Brownback took over, we've had money that we've been sending to the federal government that we could be getting back through CanCare expansion that the governor has refused to take because he doesn't like the president. I think that that's a foolish reason to make that decision. I think that Medicaid expansion, although it wouldn't be popular with a lot of the incumbents with in Topeka, like Representative Billinger, who's voted against it, I think that that would be another step in the right direction in terms of shoring up our budget shortfall for the fiscal year 2017.
And would it be enough to follow along with Pat's question?
That by itself, I don't think will be. We're going to need several different options to fix this problem. You know, repealing the LLC may be a step in the right direction. It's not going to be enough. CanCare expansion, taking the money that we're sending to Washington and jumping through those loopholes so that we get that money back isn't going to be enough by itself. Combining those with several other smaller projects should be enough to set us on the right course for 2017 in terms of paying our bills. We didn't get into this mess overnight, though. We're probably not going to be able to get out of it overnight either.
All right. Perfect timing there, and I'm going to move into one of the first submitted questions to me via social media. That seems like a perfect time to do so because we've been talking about the revenue or the state revenue effects of the governor's glide path to zero, but let's talk about the other side of it, what he pitched it on initially. And Dustin Roths of Hayes got with me on Facebook and asked, how do each of you feel the Kansas economy would be doing without the income tax cuts for small businesses? 90 seconds to you, Alex Herman.
Well, I think to figure that out, we only need to look at the states around us and how their economies are doing compared to Kansas. Kansas is in a recession right now. Some will point to the falling commodity prices for oil, grain, and say, well, that's really the problem. The fact of the matter is, though, is Nebraska isn't having the same problems Kansas is. Oklahoma is not having the same problems Kansas is. These states are both very similar to Kansas, too. While obviously those factors for commodities are part of the piece, it's pretty clear that Governor Brownback's failed tax experiment within this state has put our state into the recession because none of the states around us are having the same problems we are.
All right. 90 seconds for Rick Billinger.
Well, I would disagree again on one point. Oklahoma's burned through $1 billion out of the rainy day fund. It's not very rosy in Oklahoma either because the oil and gas industry has affected Oklahoma even worse than Kansas. The oil and gas is very important to Kansas, and so is agriculture. This state is still an agricultural state, and until we figure that out, we're going to be in trouble. You know, when the recession hit more in the cities, we didn't feel as much here. We feel it when cattle are low, when commodity prices are low, when oil and gas is low, when everything's low at the same time, we feel it. And, you know, part of my disappointment with the governor is that he hasn't come back and said, listen, here's where we are today. We need to make some adjustments. You know, our commodity prices are down, our oil and gas is down. We need to make some adjustments here. And that, to me, is a disappointing part that we haven't made some adjustments.
My turn?
Pat, back to you.
Okay. The missed revenue projections, they're a regular occurrence now on a monthly basis. Recently, the governor had appointed a special blue ribbon panel to figure out what was wrong with that group, which included himself, the revenue secretary, economists from 3 universities in the state, and of their array of solutions to fix the forecasting. One was to add full-time economists, but another one was to simply hide, not reveal to the public what the monthly revenue projections are. Granted, the governor can do this by himself, but I would think the legislature, if they wanted to be insistent, could force those to remain public. Would you support those numbers being in the public's view?
Yes, I would. I think that anytime things are going good, the public needs to know it, and if it's going bad, they also need to know that. I don't think that's something that should not be put out. I think them numbers should be put out.
And do you have any recommendations for how they can improve the accuracy?
You know, for a large number of years, they were pretty close on the deal. The recent years since the tax cuts is where they've really struggled. And they've not only struggled on the income side of it, they've struggled on the sales tax side of it. They've struggled all the way down. And, you know, one of the things, I know that they thought the oil price would turn around, and it really hasn't rebounded like they thought it might. You know, they use the price from New York versus Kansas. And, you know, there are things like that I think we can improve on. I hope, you know, I think the folks in legislative services are very, very good with numbers. So.
90 seconds for you.
When Governor Brownback first initiated this tax plan, obviously he faced some criticism from others who said that it wasn't going to work. What we have found with this is that even Governor Brownback's critics underestimated how poor this tax plan was. Representative Billinger has mentioned that he's disappointed in the governor. However, his voting record also does show that he's voted with the governor 97.7% of the time in the last legislative session. What I feel needs to be done is that we need to do what we can to isolate Governor Brownback from the situation. Take a big, long look at where we are as a state and work to move beyond these failed tax policies to really get away from these failed tax policies to really figure out where things are going wrong with the government's estimates in terms of revenue, because what we're finding out is that it's even worse than what his sharpest critics had predicted it would be.
All right. We'll stay with you, and let's shift a little bit here to one of the other elephants in the room here in the state of Kansas, because recently the state Supreme Court held hearings on the adequacy portion of school finance from the so-called Gannon case, where they claim that Kansas should be providing as much as $500 million additional dollars in funding to K-12 education alone. Do you agree with the Gannon case's assertion that schools are inadequately funded by the state, and if so, what's your solution? 90 seconds. Mr. Herman.
I assume we're talking about the budget prior to the Gannon case being decided. Obviously, we have the Kansas legislature has its most important constitutional duty, which is to make sure that schools are adequately funded. Our Supreme Court looked at what had been done with Governor Brownback in terms of this block grant plan and stepping away from the formula which we had been using for an extended period of time. The Supreme Court has made its decision and said schools aren't adequately being funded, and I agree with the Supreme Court. What we found is that under the Supreme Court's or under the block grant as Governor Brownback proposed it, this ends up hurting rural schools in Kansas especially. I believe that all children, regardless of whether you live in Johnson County or Wallace County, deserve to get as good of education as this state can provide, and the same education as well. Governor Brownback's tax plan under the block grant did not balance those two out. I agree with the Supreme Court's decision. I look forward to making sure that we aren't in this situation in the future.
Stop you there, and we'll give 90 seconds to Rick Billinger.
Well, I don't think they've come to a final decision on this adequacy yet.
No.
So, yeah, so there's nothing to agree with or disagree with at this point in time. But
well, the litigants in the case have put the number at $500 million. So my question was about whether you felt that the litigants had a point, not what you felt about a decision that hasn't been rendered.
well, as far as the amount, if it's 500 million, there's no 500 million to be found. You know, the state just doesn't have them funds available at this time. You know, if they do it over a period of time or something, that may be some way to adequately figure this thing out. But you know, a new formula will be worked on next year, and I will work diligently to make sure that the rural schools, whether smaller schools, which in this 40th district there are many small schools, or if the largest school in here would be Hayes High. You know, I will work diligently to make sure that our schools are funded at a proper level. You know, I voted against the block grants because of the suit that went in, and the Supreme Court said this does not work. And you know, many of us didn't want to do away with the
Have to stop you
original formula
there.
until we had something different.
Right.
Well, I'm sure we'll get back to this
We'll
later on.
just keep right with it.
Pat, just stay with it.
Two-part, I guess. First being, do you think there was anything wrong with the old funding formula? And since the block grant is going to be done in 2017, regardless of what the court comes out to say, what do you think is the most important thing to ensure that we do have, that we do allow our children to have equal educational opportunities throughout the state?
Well, I think it's very important that we have the equal opportunity, whether you be at a small school in Brewster or Hayes High. You should have the same opportunities. You know, there obviously was some issues with the original, the 1992 plan. There was some problems there. I mean, were lawsuits 15 out of the last 17 years. Yeah, so, you know, and some people say, well, it just wasn't funded. Well, maybe it wasn't funded, you know, to the amount that it should be. We'll find that out when the Supreme Court comes back with their adequacy deal, and we'll find out whether or not we were funded at the proper amount or not. But, you know, it's unfortunate that we continue to have these discussions about, you know, whether or not we have enough or don't have enough. We need to make sure it's the right amount, you know, whatever that might be. And whatever we come up with in the new formula, we need to make sure that it's fair and equitable. I mean, there's educating a student at Tri-Plains at Winona is quite different than in Hayes High. You know, they have to go 25 miles to get a loaf of bread, a gallon of milk. You know, and them kids are on buses for a long length of time. So, you know, there's no simple answers on that either. I mean, it's one of them things that we're just going to have to work hard to come up with something that's fair and equitable to all our schools.
Okay. Alex, what suggestions might you have?
Well, obviously the old funding formula had its issues. You know, the job of the legislature is to continue to try to make something like the former funding formula better. The block grant, I believe, took us a step in the wrong direction, though. I think starting with the old funding formula, tweaking it there, as Representative Billinger mentioned, you know, this is a 24-year-old formula. Obviously, there may be time for some tweaks and updates with it. However, I think that's going to be a lot closer position for us to take than anything that Governor Brownback has cooked up in terms of his failed tax policies for the state of Kansas.
Okay, I got us talking about the Gannon case and the Supreme Court, but I want to circle back to the Supreme Court for a moment here, because the state Supreme Court has become a campaign issue. Gannon, Montoy decision before it, appeals on the Carr brothers, and so during the primaries we saw a lot about the Supreme Court and the Kansas court. A lot of people said that they had overreached their authority and therefore should not be retained. In your opinion, has the Kansas Supreme Court done a good job of being impartial and fair as the final bulwark of the Kansas Constitution? 90 seconds for Alex Herman.
Obviously, it's always easy to Monday morning quarterback and say, you know, Kansas Supreme Court got this decision right, that decision wrong. For the most part, in my practice as an attorney, in where I have to regularly read case law. The Supreme Court has done far more good than bad. I feel that the push to not retain the justices would be is a political stunt, frankly, so that Governor Brownback in his last 2 years in office can pack the court with his own appointments. Obviously, the Kansas Supreme Court got the decision on the Carr brothers wrong, and there's been a lot of publicity made about that. What hasn't been made public is what they really did get wrong in terms of it. The Kansas Supreme Court didn't release the Carr brothers, didn't set them free or anything like that. They simply ordered that they had to be resentenced. While it's traumatic for the family to have to go through that experience again if they were to be resentenced, which the U.S. Supreme Court has determined they don't have to be. The Kansas Supreme Court has done more good than bad. I think that the alternative of having Governor Brownback stack the Supreme Court with his appointments would be a bad decision.
90 seconds to you.
Well, I'm not an attorney like Alex is, but as far as the Supreme Court, I think that's up to each individual is going to have to determine whether or not they like the way some of these judgments have come down, whether they're pro-school and think, well, it's important that they stick up for the schools, or if this Carr brothers deal, if they think that. I think that's going to be an individual choice for each person that votes. In the past, I went into the ballot box and I've had people tell me they went in and they had no idea who some of these judges were, and sometimes I'd just leave it blank because I would hate to vote yes to retain one that wasn't any good, or vote no for to eliminate someone that's very good. I think this is probably an opportunity for our voters to educate themselves and make sure of, what is really going on, whether they want to vote for retention or not.
Well, hopefully, if they're watching this program, they're trying to do a little bit of that educating, so that would be good. I'd like to go back and revisit CAPERS, the Public Employee Retirement System. We haven't made a payment for this year or last year, the regularly scheduled payment, although we did issue $1 billion worth of what were they called, retirement bonds or something. But the $1 billion that we invested in the stock markets, in hoping that we get at least 8% return, so that we can offset the interest payments that we'll be making on that $1 billion. Granted, it's a long-term deal, but the first year did not turn out well. The stock market did not return that 8%, and our interest payments are still there at 5%. In retrospect, even though it's only been a little over a year, do you think that was the right decision to make? And are you comfortable with with how solid the CAPERS fund is?
Thank you for that question. And I mentioned earlier that's one of the committees that I serve on. And I do believe it was the right decision. And if you look real close, when that was done, we hit the low on the bond market. If you look back, and this isn't just a little short period of time, but if you look, we hit the low. We also hit a low spot in the stock market. And maybe we're not getting as good a return right now, but if you look at this, we look 20 years, we look 25 years, we look 30 years back. And if we're on track, and that's even including the 08 with the big downturn, we still will come out well ahead. The way I look at this is it's an unfunded liability that we have. We owe the folks that we say, when you get ready to retire, you're going to get a check from CAPERS. We need to make sure that that money is in there. This $1 billion went over here into the check, into the bank for CAPERS. That money is there, cannot be touched. The first thing we have to do when we do a budget is take care of our bond and interest. That's first and foremost. So that's going to get paid right up front. So I think it was a good move. I think, how do we know? It's going to be a long-term deal. Right. And hopefully, that the stock market will continue to to rise, and we'll get that 8%. If you look back, like I said, even including the '08 downturn,
To stop you
we're
there,
averaging at 8%.
Okay.
and we'll turn it over to Alex Herman.
You know, this business of selling bonds to pay our bills, I think, is an example of Governor Brownback bringing D.C. politics to Kansas. Borrowing money instead of paying bills, I think, is always a poor decision. The governor has supported that. Representative Billinger has supported that 97.7% of the time with his votes with Governor Brownback. I think that, frankly, this is mortgaging our future for our children. I think that this has been a poor decision on the legislature and the governor's part. And if I'm elected, I would work to come up with other means other than selling junk bonds to pay our bills.
Okay, let's cycle back to a statement that you made earlier about Medicaid. On the eastern side of the state, we've seen hospitals have started to close. The quality of care for Kansas seems to be at risk. The state has refused to expand Medicaid under the auspices of Obamacare, but even some Republicans, most notably former Insurance Commissioner Sandy Prager, have warmed to the idea. Should the state expand Medicare offerings? And if so, the state has a concomitant fiscal responsibility. We've already said that the state is pretty much bound in money. How does the state pay for its obligation if we do choose to expand Medicare?
If we choose to expand Medicaid, we're going to be getting additional monies to pay from the federal government to pay for that expansion. We're actually going to even have money left over after doing that as well. And you know, we talk about it like it's money from the federal government. It's not really money from the federal government. It's our tax dollars that we are sending to Washington that we aren't taking back because the governor doesn't like the president. I think that robbing from the citizens of the state of Kansas is a wrong decision to make, especially when your only justification for it is that you don't like the president. This is our money. These are our citizens that would benefit from the use of that money, and taking that money is going to not only help pay for the Medicaid, or not only going to pay for the Medicaid expansion, but also leave us money to pay other bills as well.
Okay.
Well, the CanCare expansion has not had a committee meeting. There has not been hearings, and there has not been any committee meetings. I believe that this year we need to have these hearings. We need to sit down and see what the costs are, what the benefits are, and come up and decide whether it's beneficial or it's not. I've visited with all the rural hospitals in this district, and I've told them, I said, you know, they've come up with a revenue neutral plan, the Kansas Hospital Association. I said, you know, if we can do this, are you folks in favor of it? And I said, now here's the understanding. If the Hayes Medical Center gets $1 million next year, and then the next year the federal government says, well, you're only going to get 80%, that they would understand that they would get $800,000 the next year, and the state doesn't have the $200,000 to fill in. You know, I think we need to have this conversation. We need to sit down, have hearings, and we need to decide if it's beneficial. We need to move with it and hear both sides of the arguments and see what is the best way to approach it.
Okay. Switch gears to guns on campus. The law was passed, I think, almost 4 years ago, but it's going to take effect July 1 of 2017, that concealed firearms will be allowed on college campuses without a permit, without training, without anything, although it has had opposition from the Board of Regents, the individual universities, student government, staff, faculty, campus police chiefs, other law enforcement officials. Do you support leaving this law in place? Why or why not?
Well, I support the right to carry concealed carry. However, as far as on campus, I think we need to work with, the presidents of our universities, the law enforcement at the universities. I don't know, if they don't have security, if the building is secured, they can deny carrying into a building.
Right, but that's cost prohibitive.
Well,
Nearly $1 million per building.
right.
$1 million?
$1 million per building is what's being estimated.
Okay, so, that's probably not going to work. But, there's arguments on both sides of this. The theater shooting in Colorado, if somebody might have had a concealed carry, may have been able to save many lives. I mean, there's arguments on both sides of this.
So you'd support keeping it in place?
Well, I would, and I think that probably there might have to be some working with the universities to make it where it can work. Like you said, if the cost is $1 million a building, that's cost prohibitive. That won't work. So there may be some solutions there.
Look, I'm a gun owner myself. I support the Second Amendment. But that being said, I don't like guns being used as an excuse for Governor Brownback and his supporters in the legislature, like Representative Billinger, to usurp local control on matters like this. I see no reason why campuses shouldn't be able to make decisions in this regard, make decisions that affect them on a day-to-day basis. The ideas in Topeka with Governor Brownback and Representative Billinger that one size fits all, I think is a terrible position to take. I would prefer a more local control, allow each university to make those decisions in terms of what's best for them, determine what they can afford, what they can't afford, and go from there.
Okay.
All right, as we're starting to run a little bit low on time, I want to be sure that one more question that was presented to me via social media gets asked, and that comes from someone that we're probably all familiar with, and this is Sean Musil of Hayes. Sean was expressing some concern about what he sees as an excessive polarization in American politics today, and that it's drawn into the state of Kansas. And he sees Democrats and Republicans unwilling, unable to work with each other as one of the great problems. So he asked, how will you work with both parties and not just within what your own party says? Because it seems, and I'm going to quote him, like both sides have gone off the deep end. Your response to that? 90 seconds, Alex Herman.
Well, obviously we don't need to look any further than this presidential debate to see the chasm that's existing between both sides in it. In Kansas, I think we're in a different position, though. The two sides really that we have in Kansas aren't divided along the Democrat and Republican side as much as they are divided along the people, or Governor Brownback and his supporters, like Representative Billinger, and those that have stood in the way of Governor Brownback. With the primary elections in Kansas, I think it's become pretty clear that voters in Kansas are fed up with the policies and are ready to move beyond Brownback. Obviously, at the end of the day, though, we still need to a legislature that has a majority. If it doesn't have a filibuster or a veto-proof majority, is still going to need to work with the governor. I'm running as a Democrat in Northwest Kansas. I have a lot of Republican friends. I'm willing to work with absolutely anyone as long as they're coming up with common sense solutions for this state. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what the party label is. Making decisions that are right for Kansas are what's most important for this state.
All right, 90 seconds, Rick Billinger.
Well, I would say that the polarization is in Topeka, and I would give an example of trying to fix the tax deal. And Alex keeps jumping on this 97% of me voting with the governor. The governor, we don't vote with the governor. We vote for legislation. We vote for policy. And there's no one in our party telling us how to vote. The Democrats on the other side that wanted to join us and vote for this tax deal were told they couldn't by leadership. I have some very good friends that are Democrats told me, said, Rick, I'd love to help you guys out. I was a whip on it. And they said, we'd like to help you out, but our leadership won't let us vote for it. So talk about polarization, there is. But I think most people respect what I do and say in Topeka. I've done 3 times I've done reconsiders, and 3 times I've been successful in getting reconsiders. That is very unusual. But you're not going to get people to reconsider some legislation that was just voted on if you don't have the trust and respect of your colleagues. And I'm talking both sides of the aisle. And I think people trust what I say and they value what I say. And, you know, it's happened, like I said, 3 times where I've done reconsiders and was successful.
Thank
Okay.
you.
It's funny you mentioned Mayor Musel. My next question was kind of dealing with local government. A legislative approved property tax lid on local governments will effectively prohibit cities and counties from increasing property taxes beyond the rate of inflation without putting it to a vote of the people to approve. Do you believe this law will do anything other than handcuff local governments? And would you work to repeal the law before it begins?
Very good question again. I don't think there's enough votes to do any repealing. So first and foremost, I don't think that will happen. What I would say is I think we need to work very hard to make some exceptions in here. For instance, a couple of the counties that I represent today, one is Wallace County, smallest county in the state of Kansas. They might have to have a vote to buy a fire truck or a police car. You know, I mean, it could straddle them that much. The dates don't work on the elections. There are some things that we need to fix in the bill that's there. And I've been working with several people trying to get some of these adjustments made. And I think what we're going to have to try to do is work to make it a better bill.
Okay. Alex?
You know, obviously I'm opposed to anything that handcuffs local governments, and I do believe that this bill handcuffs local governments. What we've seen over the last 6 years is a lot of state-provided services, like services for mental health, that have become far more localized at the county level. And I'll give you an example here from work. The High Plains Mental Health Center used to have an individual that would go out and check on the more high-risk individuals in the community. We've seen that position eliminated, and as such an increase in our jail population. If we have cuts at the state level, local costs are going to go up along with that, and what we are really doing is putting ourselves in a position by doing this to not be able to effectively govern ourselves at a local level just because the state has someone like Governor Brownback who adopts a failed tax experiment.
Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for questions. So we'll move now to closing statements. We start with 90 seconds for Rick Billinger.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank Smokey Hill and you guys for coming out today and holding this debate. I appreciate it. One of the things I mentioned earlier is that the Senate will work on our own budget, and I think that's important, that we come up with our own budget. Don't rely on a budget from the governor. Let's come up with our own budget. One of the things you can count on from me is I have a common sense approach. I'm not afraid to make the tough votes. I'm not afraid to vote against the governor. I mean, Alex might have 97% of the time I vote, maybe not on my own, but there may have been Democrats voted for the same thing. I mean, we're there to legislate. And when we're legislating, I vote to do what's best for Western Kansas and Kansas. I don't sit there and try to do anything for myself. This is for the people. I represent the people. I don't represent myself. I want to make sure that every dollar is spent wisely, that we don't waste any dollars. it's tough for the folks that are paying property tax, sales tax, income tax, and we want to make sure that every dollar is spent wisely. One other thing that I would say,
Afraid I need to stop you there. 90 seconds, wrap up for Alex Herman. Last word is yours.
Thank you, Chap. On November 8th, the residents of Northwest Kansas have a stark choice to make. Continue down the path that has destroyed our great state, or begin a new direction away from the disastrous policies of Sam Brownback. My opponent, Representative Billinger, has spent the past few years in and out of the legislature. His 97.7% voting record attests to his unabashed support for the failed policies of Governor Brownback. I pledge to you that if elected, I will work tirelessly to ensure that Kansas is put back on solid footing. I will work to restore the child care tax credit, lower sales taxes, begin replacing the billions stolen from KDOT, and ensure our schools have the funding necessary to prepare the next generation of Kansans to lead this great state. Kansas deserves better than continued failure. They deserve a senator who will advocate against special interests instead of advocating for them. A senator who will work to move Kansas beyond Brownback and his failed plan. I'm humbled every day by the significant support I've received from everyday Kansans hoping to make their state a better place to call home. I'm thankful for the generous contributions hardworking Kansans have made to make my campaign possible. I'm hopeful that by working together we move Kansas beyond Brownback. I ask for your vote on November 8th. Thank you.
Thank you both. Well, we have seen some very clear differences between these two candidates and what's been a pretty eventful debate here today. Pat Lowry, your thoughts?
Well, I think we are going to have a very challenging session ahead of us, to put it as understated as possible. I'd like to throw a bonus question out, just for the heck of it, since we kind of mentioned the divisiveness between parties, between factions. We have very controversial people running for president that are at the top of the ballot. Do you think, just for giggles, do you think it's going to have any effect on this race or any other down ballot races? Just a bonus question.
Are you hearing Republicans fed up with Trump? Are you hearing Democrats unexcited about Hillary Clinton?
Oh, absolutely. I'd be the first Democrat to say I'm not thrilled about Hillary Clinton on the ballot. A lot of people that I've talked to in that regard, a lot say that, oh, they really don't like one, oh, they really don't like the other. A lot of them say, I really am not comfortable with either of them. What effect that has on this election, I think, probably remains to be seen, though.
Right. Rick, what do you think?
I think that I'm hearing that they're very dissatisfied with both. I've heard that from both sides.
Is that the candidates, or do you think that that's the people themselves? Do you think that if we even had different candidates in there, do you think that it would be different, that the reaction from the public?
I don't know.
I think it would be. I think I've heard quite often that, the millions of people that are in this country, and we end up with two that neither one like.
Right.
I mean, the fact that these two have the lowest likability ratings among the American public, I think, probably says a lot about both candidates as well.
Well, regardless, we hope that the folks watching are going out and voting. And certainly they've had plenty of information available to them on the 40th Senate District. So as we are starting to wrap up here, I want to thank both Rick Billinger of Goodland and Alex Herman of Hayes for joining us in this Kansas candidates debate on Smoky Hills Public Television, the staff here at Smoky Hills Public TV, and my partner in crime, Pat Lowry, editor and publisher for the Hayes Daily News. Thank you for watching. Do vote this November. Take care.